In the dim stillness of a North African morning, long before rifles cracked or engines roared, a different kind of shock swept across a captured American supply depot near Fériana. German soldiers, lean from months of hunger, moved past rows of wooden crates that seemed to stretch into the horizon. Inside those crates lay something they had not seen in months: real meat, real coffee, real sugar, and enough calories to make a starving man pause in disbelief. It was the 17th of February 1943. The Battle of Kasserine Pass had barely begun. Yet in that quiet depot, surrounded by mountains of American rations, German officers confronted a truth far more unsettling than any armored breakthrough. Their enemy was fighting a different kind of war, one fueled not only by tanks or aircraft, but by abundance, by a supply machine capable of feeding soldiers 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day, while German troops survived on barely half that. If a modern army truly marches on its stomach, then what happens when one side enters battle already starving? And what did this moment reveal about the war Germany believed it could win? Long before German soldiers stepped into that depot at Fériana, the seeds of hunger had already been planted. The Africa Corps arrived in North Africa in February 1941, carrying confidence, experience, and a reputation for battlefield brilliance. What they lacked fatally was a supply chain capable of sustaining them. Every crate of food, every tin of meat, every ounce of fuel had to cross a hostile Mediterranean, survive British naval attacks, then move across a desert with only a single narrow artery, the Via Balbia. It was a road never designed to feed an army fighting hundreds of miles from port. As distances grew and truck shortages worsened, commanders stretched their rations until the numbers made no sense. Food meant for 10 men fed 12, then 15, then 20. Soldiers lost weight steadily, 10 pounds, then 20, then more. The desert punished every error. Heat, dehydration, and the sheer emptiness of Libya turned hunger from discomfort into a slow erosion of strength. The Eastern Front, launched in June 1941, compounded the disaster. Operation Barbarossa was built on a fantasy, a lightning campaign intended to end before winter. Its planners prepared food, fuel, and equipment for a few months of rapid victory. Instead, German soldiers marched hundreds of miles into a country where the roads dissolved into mud, the railways used the wrong gauge, and the distances swallowed every attempt at resupply. Horses died from exhaustion, trucks broke down without spare parts, bread froze into bricks, and as Soviet forces retreated, they destroyed farms, grain stores, and infrastructure. The Hunger Plan, Berlin's dream of feeding the army by starving Soviet civilians, collapsed on contact with reality. There was simply nothing to take. By late 1941, the front lines were cold, exposed, and chronically underfed. Soldiers wore summer uniforms in temperatures that plunged below -30 degrees Celsius. Hot meals became rare, then impossible. Frozen bread, thin soup, and whatever could be scavenged kept men alive, but only barely. Medical officers recorded rapid weight loss, weakened immune systems, and a rise in illness long before Stalingrad turned starvation into catastrophe. Across 2 continents, the pattern was unmistakable. Germany was fighting a global war with a peacetime supply system. Logistics, an afterthought in German doctrine, was already becoming the decisive battlefield. And as the war expanded, the gap between what German soldiers needed and what they received grew wider with every passing month. By the time German forces overran the American depot near Fériana, the contrast in wartime nutrition had already hardened into an uncomfortable truth. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was still taking shape, but to the men who tore open those crates, that moment felt like stepping into another world. American K-Rations meant only as emergency food offered nearly 2,830 calories a day, and they were packaged with a kind of casual abundance. Real ham and eggs, instant coffee, sugar tablets, biscuits, fruit bars, chocolate, even gum and cigarettes. For soldiers who had grown used to Ersatz coffee and bread laced with fillers, it bordered on surreal. And those weren't the good rations. Nearby were crates of ration Type A, fresh meat and vegetables, and Type B, brimming with canned foods of every variety. Real coffee by the ton, condensed milk, chocolate that had not been melted and reformed a dozen times. Even ice cream mix, shipped across the Atlantic in the middle of a global war simply because American logistics could make it so. The Germans advanced across the battlefield with tactical skill. But here, in this quiet storage yard, America revealed a different kind of superiority. One built on railroads, factories, farms, merchant fleets, and an industrial system capable of projecting comfort thousands of miles from home. If North Africa exposed the rations gap, Stalingrad exposed the human cost. In September 1942, German soldiers fighting in the shattered ruins of the city received about 1,800 calories per day, barely enough to maintain weight in peacetime, let alone in constant urban combat. By December, once the Sixth Army was fully encircled, their ration fell to roughly 100 grams of bread a day, 400 calories, less than what an American soldier swallowed as a mid-morning snack. Men who once marched confidently across Europe now fought with sunken cheeks, trembling hands, and minds dulled by hunger. Wounds that should have healed in days took weeks. Trench foot and frostbite spread. Soldiers collapsed not from enemy fire, but from starvation. Medical officers described it as a progressive fading, a slow draining of the strength and will that once defined the German army. Meanwhile, across the world, American forces were eating with a consistency unmatched in modern warfare. Studies from the Quartermaster Corps documented daily intake between 3,200 and 4,100 calories during field operations. Hot meals arrived regularly from standardized mobile kitchens. Supply chains moved food alongside ammunition and fuel with the same discipline and priority. The United States treated nourishment not as a luxury, but as a weapon, a force multiplier that kept bodies strong, minds alert, and units capable of sustained combat. The war's midpoint revealed a paradox. The German army was still tactically formidable, still capable of bold maneuvers and fierce counterattacks. But beneath the surface, it was fighting on a shrinking reserve of calories, strength, and time. The Americans, by contrast, were fighting on full stomachs and full supply lines. In a conflict of endurance, the outcome was already beginning to take shape. The turning point of the logistics war arrived in the winter of 1944, during the last great German offensive in the West. Hitler's plan for the Ardennes, what the world remembers as the Battle of the Bulge, was bold, desperate, and fatally dependent on fuel Germany no longer possessed. The Führer allocated 28 million liters of gasoline for the operation. Only half of that ever reached the starting line. Field Marshal von Rundstedt's armored spearheads began the attack with barely 6 days of fuel, and even that calculation assumed smooth progress in terrain that was anything but forgiving. From the beginning, the offensive depended on capturing American supply depots. No fuel seizure meant no breakthrough. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, leading one of the assault's fastest armored columns, understood this better than anyone. His tanks needed American gasoline to reach the Meuse River. German intelligence identified the Stavello depot, 3 million gallons of high-grade fuel, as the prize that might change the entire campaign. Peiper came within 1,000 feet of it. American forces destroyed the stockpiles before his men could touch a single drum. By December 19th, only 4 days into the offensive, the inevitable happened. Tanks that had roared out of the forests sputtered to a halt. General Hasso von Montefel's armor stopped within sight of the Meuse. Soldiers climbed down from machines that had carried them through years of war, now powerless because the Reich could no longer feed them fuel any more than it could feed them calories. The offensive collapsed under its own logistical starvation, and the suffering was not confined to the battlefield. By early 1945, the German home front was unraveling. Official civilian rations listed roughly 1,670 calories per day on paper. In practice, amid broken rail lines, Allied bombing, and a black market that devoured whatever food still moved, millions survived on barely 800 to 1,200 calories. Children showed signs of acute malnutrition. The elderly died in numbers that no propaganda could conceal. Even frontline units, ostensibly the highest priority, received rations of such poor quality that their medical records read like the charts of famine victims. Weight loss, weakened immune systems, slow healing, chronic fatigue. Then came the contrast that many German veterans would remember for the rest of their lives. Captured soldiers, shipped to POW camps in the United States, encountered a system that fed them almost exactly what American troops received, about 3,200 calories per day. Men who weighed 120 or 130 pounds on capture gained 30, 40, sometimes 50 pounds in captivity. Ernst Floater, an 18-year-old soldier captured in Normandy, described his first American meal with disbelief. Real eggs, warm bread, fresh fruit, and coffee that tasted nothing like the scorched substitutes he had known in the Wehrmacht. The irony was impossible to ignore. At the very moment the Reich was collapsing under hunger at home and starvation at the front, its captured soldiers were gaining weight under American care. It was not just generosity. It was proof of a deeper truth. The United States possessed a logistical system powerful enough to feed its enemies, better than Germany could feed its own army. To American planners, the war was never just a contest of tactics or firepower. It was a test of capacity, of whether a nation could sustain millions of men across oceans, continents, and climates. The United States entered World War II with a conviction that logistics was not an administrative burden, but a pillar of strategy. Food, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, these were not background details. They were the foundation upon which every battlefield decision rested. Nowhere was this philosophy more visible than in America's truck fleets. While Germany struggled to produce just over 300,000 trucks during the entire war, the United States built 2.6 million. Standardized parts, interchangeable components, and factory lines running day and night turned mobility into an American signature. The Red Ball Express, the lifeline after D-Day, moved 12,000 tons of supplies per day using more than 6,000 trucks on a non-stop loop. It was not glamorous work, but it kept entire armies alive and moving. No German doctrine had anything comparable. Food, too, became a deliberate expression of American power. Ice cream was classified as a basic food, and the U.S. Navy built floating ice cream barges in the Pacific to deliver it. Field kitchens fed 150 to 200 soldiers twice daily, even on active fronts. Critics would later call it indulgence. Commanders called it morale, the invisible force multiplier that kept units cohesive and confident through months of grinding combat. When the war ended, the same logistical machine that had fed the American military became the engine of Europe's recovery. Initially, U.S. occupation policy in Germany was austere, even punitive. But as famine loomed and political instability threatened the continent, Washington shifted course. Directive JCS 1779 replaced earlier restrictions, and the Marshall Plan began pouring millions of tons of food into a starving Europe. American abundance, once a weapon of war, became the backbone of rebuilding a fractured world. To many around the globe, this revealed a simple but profound truth. American power was not defined solely by weapons or victories, but by the ability to sustain life, its own soldiers, its allies, even its former enemies. In a century defined by conflict, logistics emerged not only as a battlefield advantage, but as a force shaping the post-war order. In the end, the lesson of the Calorie Gap is not simply about numbers on ration charts. It is about the unseen machinery that keeps an army alive, the farmers who grew the wheat, the factory workers who packed the cans, the logisticians who calculated demands down to the ounce, and the truck drivers who carried food forward under fire. These were the people who shaped the real balance of power in World War II, long before tanks clashed or artillery thundered. The German army never lacked courage or tactical ability. Its soldiers fought with determination in deserts, forests, and shattered cities. But bravery cannot substitute for nourishment, and no strategy can survive on an empty stomach. By 1943, the truth was visible to every German soldier who opened an American ration crate. They were fighting an enemy whose strength flowed not only from industry, but from a logistical philosophy that treated food as a weapon of endurance. America's ability to feed its soldiers 3,500 calories a day across multiple continents was more than a feat of supply. It was a reflection of national capacity, one that continued after the guns fell silent. The same abundance that sustained armies in wartime would, through the Marshall Plan, help feed a devastated Europe back to life. Few nations in history have wielded such power, the power to destroy and the power to rebuild, both carried in the same ships that once crossed the Atlantic. And so, the story that began at a quiet depot in Tunisia becomes something larger than a wartime anecdote. It is a reminder that global conflict is shaped by more than bravery and tactics. It is shaped by logistics, by calories, fuel, and the infrastructure required to keep soldiers moving one more mile. An army marches on its stomach, and in World War II, the side that could feed its men won the war that truly mattered, the war of endurance. As we look at our own world, still defined by fragile supply chains and rising tensions, the question remains, have we learned the lesson of 1943? Do we understand that the strength of a nation begins long before a battle is fought? If this history resonates with you, its lessons, its warnings, and its echoes in our present, join the discussion below. And consider subscribing as we continue exploring the stories and strategies that shape the world we live in.